Bim's marriage to Femi had once been a fairy tale, the kind of union she had always dreamed of as a young girl. Their love story began like a scene from her favorite romantic novels. When they first met, Femi's charm and kindness were like a warm breeze that melted her heart. He was a man of stature, running a thriving business that garnered admiration from all corners of their community. His gestures of affection felt like treasures, a bouquet of fresh flowers just because, or surprise outings to places where they could laugh and lose themselves in each other's company. Their home brimmed with joy, with their laughter echoing off the walls, and Bim truly believed that their happiness was eternal. But time has a way of reshaping even the strongest foundations. As the years passed, an inexplicable distance began to creep into their lives. Femi no longer smiled at her the way he used to. The small gestures of affection, the spontaneous kisses on her forehead, the way he used to hold her hand in public seemed to vanish, replaced by an unsettling coolness. He became engrossed in his work, spending longer hours at the office and often arriving home late with no explanations. His silences grew heavy, filling the spaces between them with a void she couldn't bridge. Sometimes, he would sit by the window, staring out into the night as though searching for something she couldn't see. Bim felt lost. Her heart ached for the man she had fallen in love with, and the joy they had once shared seemed like a distant memory. She tried to reach out to him, to rekindle the flame that had once burned so brightly, but every attempt was met with indifference, or worse, silence. Her efforts to talk to him only deepened her frustration and sorrow. It was as though he had built an invisible wall around himself, leaving her on the outside, yearning to break through. Determined not to let their marriage crumble, Bim embarked on a mission to reignite their love. She poured her heart into her efforts, trying every avenue she could think of to reconnect with Femi. She spent hours in the kitchen crafting elaborate meals, recreating his favorite dishes with the hope that the familiar aromas would stir something in him. She bought new dresses and spent more time on her appearance, longing for him to notice her again, to see her the way he once had. But each effort was met with the same distant gaze, the same absent-minded nods. It was as though her presence barely registered in his world. Desperate for guidance, Bim turned to the elder women in her village, hoping their wisdom could offer her a way forward. One warm afternoon, she sat with Mama T, a woman whose eyes held the stories of decades of love and resilience. "Bim, my child," Mama T said with a knowing smile. "Sometimes, men forget. They forget the beauty of the journey you've shared. Take him back to the beginning. Remind him of the joy you both had, the laughter, the little moments that made your heart sing. Sometimes, all it takes is a gentle nudge to remind him of what you've built together." Bim clung to Mama Ti's words like a lifeline. That evening, she sat with Femi and spoke of the past, recounting the nights they had danced under the stars, the jokes that had left them breathless with laughter, the promises they had whispered in the dark. But as she spoke, Femi's response was muted. He nodded politely, his face distant, his mind clearly elsewhere. The memories that warmed her heart seemed to touch nothing in him. Undeterred, Bim sought advice from Auntie Kimi, another respected elder known for her practical wisdom. Sometimes, Auntie Kimi said with a glint in her eye, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Feed him with love, my dear. Cook something that reminds him of how much you care. The right meal can work wonders. Inspired, Bim threw herself into preparing an exquisite feast. She spent hours perfecting every detail, from the spices in the stew to the careful arrangement of the table. When Femi arrived home, she greeted him with a hopeful smile, her heart racing as she presented the meal. But as they sat at the table, the gulf between them felt insurmountable. Femi picked at his food, his mind seemingly 1,000 miles away. The delicious aromas and flavors that Bim had crafted with love failed to stir any spark of connection. Days turned into weeks, and Bim's despair grew. She tried surprises, thoughtful gestures, and even more heartfelt conversations. But nothing seemed to break through the barrier that had grown between them. Each passing day felt heavier, the weight of their unspoken distance pressing down on her chest. She began to wonder if their love had run its course, if the bond they had shared was now irretrievably lost. In her darkest moments, Bimp confided in her closest friend. "Titai, I feel like I'm losing my husband," she said, her voice trembling as tears streamed down her face. Titai gave her a contemplative look. "Men are complicated, Bimp," she said gently. "Sometimes, they just need something new to excite them, to wake them up." Bimp frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Maybe," Titai suggested cautiously, "you need to think outside the box. Perhaps someone else could help you reach him in a way you can't anymore." The idea startled Bimp, and she immediately dismissed it. But the seed of Titai's words lingered, growing quietly in the corners of her mind. When Aisha, their new maid, arrived, Bimp couldn't help but notice her presence. Aisha was young and full of life, her vibrant energy lighting up the house. At 22, she was beautiful, with a cheerful demeanor that seemed to ease the tension in the air. She was hardworking and humble, never asking questions and always completing her tasks with diligence. Bimp found herself watching Aisha with a mixture of admiration and something she couldn't quite name. One evening, as Aisha moved gracefully around the living room, an unsettling thought took root in Bimp's mind. Could Aisha be the key to saving her marriage? The notion horrified her, and she fought to suppress it. But as the days went by and Femi remained distant, the idea refused to leave her. Finally, one evening, Bimp called Aisha to her room. Her heart pounded as she spoke, trying to mask her inner turmoil. "Aisha," she began hesitantly, "I have something important to discuss with you." Aisha looked puzzled but nodded. "Yes, ma'am. What is it?" Bimp hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need your help to save my marriage." Aisha's brows furrowed. "How can I help?" Taking a deep breath, Bimp said words she never thought she'd utter. "I need you to get close to my husband, make him happy in ways I can't anymore." Aisha's jaw dropped as her breath hitched. "Ma'am, I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Oh, you do," Bimp replied, her tone unwavering and eyes steady. "Think about it carefully. I'm prepared to double your salary if you agree." The words echoed in Aisha's mind, leaving her both stunned and conflicted. She had not expected such a request from her employer, let alone the desperation that tinged her voice. That night, as she lay on the thin mattress in her modest room, sleep eluded her. Her thoughts churned relentlessly. She had come to this house to earn an honest living, to provide for her family back in the village, not to become entangled in someone else's personal battles. Yet the offer lingered, like a forbidden fruit, tempting her in ways she wished it wouldn't. Her conscience waged war against the allure of financial relief. With a doubled salary, she could send her younger siblings to school, pay off her family's debts, and ensure they wouldn't have to go to bed hungry anymore. But what would it cost her integrity? How could she face herself knowing she had betrayed her values? For days, Aisha avoided Bimp's gaze, her discomfort palpable. Every encounter with her employer was a painful reminder of the moral crossroads she now stood at. She had always taken pride in being honest, hardworking, and upright. But now, the thought of saying no to such a tempting offer made her feel like she was letting her family down. The image of her family's struggles haunted her. Her mother's weary face, her father's resigned sighs, and the hopeful eyes of her younger siblings, all of it pressed heavily on her chest. Could she risk disappointing them when this opportunity, however ethically murky, might be their lifeline? On the fourth day, after much internal struggle, Aisha made her decision. That evening, she found herself standing in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she approached Bimp. "I've thought about what you said," she began hesitantly, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic bubbling of the stew on the stove. Bimp turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "And I'll do it," Aisha continued, swallowing hard. "But only because I want to help you, not for the money." A look of relief washed over Bimp's face as she let out a long-held breath. Without warning, she pulled Aisha into a tight embrace. "Thank you, Aisha. You have no idea how much this means to me. You're saving my marriage." For Bimp, Aisha's agreement was a beacon of hope in the storm of her failing relationship. She had crafted a plan, one that she believed could reignite the fading love her husband, Femi, once had for her. But it wasn't Bimp she needed to change. Her hope now rested on Aisha, who would unknowingly become the linchpin of her desperate strategy. The first step was straightforward yet crucial. Bimp asked Aisha to serve Femi dinner every evening. "You need to be kind, gentle, and attentive," Bimp instructed with an intensity that made Aisha's heart race. "But don't make it obvious. Let Femi notice you naturally. Just be yourself, and let your warmth shine through." Aisha nodded hesitantly. She had never undertaken anything so delicate or morally complex. The thought of drawing attention from a married man filled her with dread. Yet, Bimp's faith in her left her with no choice but to proceed cautiously. Over the next few weeks, Aisha followed Bimp's instructions with a meticulousness born of fear and obligation. She dressed neatly, served Femi's meals with care, and even mustered soft smiles when he made conversation. Gradually, the changes were subtle but undeniable. Femi, once indifferent, began lingering at the dining table longer, his gaze holding Aisha's for moments that felt eternal. One evening, as Aisha cleared the dishes, Femi spoke unexpectedly. "You're doing a great job, Aisha," he said, his voice carrying a warmth she hadn't heard before. "Thank you, sir," she replied, forcing a polite smile, though unease prickled her skin. "You seem different," he added, his words heavy with unspoken curiosity. Aisha's heart sank. Was this progress or a step toward disaster? Meanwhile, Bimp watched from the shadows, her emotions swinging between relief and regret. Femi was noticing Aisha, as she had hoped, but the growing bond between them felt like a betrayal of her own making. Had she pushed too far? One night, unable to bear the uncertainty, Bimp confronted Aisha in the kitchen. "How's it going?" she asked, her tone laced with both hope and apprehension. Aisha hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think he's starting to notice." Bimp's chest tightened, her relief overshadowed by a creeping sense of dread. "Good. But remember, this is only to save my marriage. Don't lose sight of that." "I won't," Aisha promised, though the guilt in her heart told a different story. As the days turned into weeks, Femi's behavior shifted even more. He began coming home earlier, his demeanor softer, his attention increasingly fixed on Aisha. He complimented her cooking, laughed at her jokes, and even offered to help carry dishes back to the kitchen. Bimp saw these changes and told herself they were a sign her plan was working. Yet, deep down, she couldn't shake the fear that she had opened a door she couldn't close. And then came the night when the line blurred completely, a fleeting moment when Femi's lingering gaze met Aisha's, and the air between them crackled with an intensity neither dared to name. For Aisha, it was the point of no return. For Bimp, it was a reckoning she hadn't anticipated. Bimp wasn't sure how to feel about the changes happening around her. On one hand, she was relieved to see her husband, Femi, smiling more often, a sight that had become increasingly rare over the years. On the other hand, a gnawing unease settled in her chest, like an invisible storm brewing just beneath the surface. The atmosphere in their home, once predictable and steady, now felt fraught with tension she couldn't ignore. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Femi spoke up, his tone laced with genuine appreciation. "This is incredible," he said, gesturing at the meal in front of him. "Aisha, you truly outdid yourself tonight." Bimp forced a smile, though it barely reached her eyes. "I'm glad you're enjoying the meals," she said, her voice tight and carefully measured. Femi turned briefly to his wife, acknowledging her comment with a quick glance before shifting his attention back to Aisha. "She's quite talented," he added with a small nod, his words carrying an air of admiration that made Bimp's stomach churn. The rift between them widened in ways Bimp could no longer pretend to ignore. Then came the night that would change everything. Femi arrived home late, the faint but unmistakable scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to him. Bimp had stayed up, her heart racing with a cocktail of fear and suspicion as she waited for him. "Where were you?" she asked the moment he walked into the dimly lit living room. Her voice trembled despite her attempt to sound composed. Work, he replied curtly, his eyes avoiding hers as he removed his shoes with deliberate slowness. Tears pricked at Bimp's eyes, her chest tightening with a deep, unbearable ache. She felt the sting of betrayal searing through her, a pain made sharper by the knowledge that she had invited this chaos into their lives. I hope you remember that I'm still your wife, Femi, she said, her voice breaking. Femi didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the silence of their once happy home. The distance between them had become a chasm, and Bimp couldn't help but wonder if she had made the gravest mistake of her life. As days turned into weeks, the tension in the household reached a boiling point. Aisha, unable to bear the growing strain, decided to confront Bimp one morning. She found her in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she prepared breakfast. I can't do this anymore, Aisha said, her voice breaking. It's wrong, and it's tearing me apart. Bimp froze, her eyes narrowing as she turned to face Aisha. You can't back out now, she said, her tone a mix of desperation and frustration. I need you, but it's ruining everything, Aisha cried, tears streaming down her face. Your husband is falling for me, and I can't let this go on. Bimp's heart sank, the weight of Aisha's words crushing her. She had orchestrated this situation, believing it was the only way to salvage her crumbling marriage. But now, the reality of her choices was spiraling out of control. Femi, perceptive as ever, began to notice the unusual dynamics in the household. While Aisha maintained her cheerful and polite demeanor, there was something about her behavior that seemed overly deliberate. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the way Bimp reacted whenever Aisha's name came up in conversation. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Femi turned to his wife with a furrowed brow. You've been acting differently lately, he said, his tone both curious and concerned. Is there something you're not telling me? Bimp forced a laugh, waving his concerns away with a dismissive gesture. I don't know what you mean. Everything is fine, she said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. But Femi wasn't convinced. The tension between them grew as he started piecing together the subtle but significant changes around him. Aisha, sensing his growing suspicion, made a conscious effort to distance herself. She avoided prolonged eye contact and kept her interactions with Femi brief, her guilt weighing heavily on her. One day, as she cleared his plate after dinner, Femi caught her arm gently. Aisha, he said softly, his eyes searching hers. Have I done something to upset you? No, sir, Aisha replied quickly, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. But her evasiveness only deepened his curiosity. He began to question the nature of their relationship and wondered if there was more to her behavior than met the eye. Unable to suppress his curiosity any longer, Femi confronted Aisha in the kitchen one evening. Aisha, tell me the truth, he demanded, his tone firm but not unkind. Why have you been avoiding me? Aisha froze, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the counter. She knew the moment she had been dreading had finally arrived. I'm sorry, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sorry for what? Femi pressed, his voice rising with urgency. Before she could respond, Bimp entered the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. Leave her alone, Femi, Bimp said, her voice firm but tinged with desperation. Femi turned to his wife, his expression a mix of confusion and anger. What's going on here? I want answers, Bimp. With a deep, shuddering breath, Bimp finally confessed. She told him everything, her feelings of loneliness, her desperation to save their marriage, and the ill-conceived decision to involve Aisha. Her words poured out in a torrent, each one heavier than the last. Femi stared at her in disbelief, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You did what? He shouted, his voice echoing through the room. I only wanted to make you happy, Bimp sobbed, tears streaming down her face. I thought this was the only way to bring us closer. But Femi's anger was palpable. You betrayed my trust, Bimp. How could you do something so foolish? Aisha stood in the corner, silent and trembling, As the weight of the situation bore down on her, Femi grabbed his car keys and stormed out of the house, leaving both women in a suffocating silence. That night, as Bimp cried herself to sleep, she wondered if her marriage could ever recover from the damage she had caused. Aisha, too, lay awake, her mind racing with guilt and regret. The following morning, Aisha approached Bimp, her eyes red and swollen. "I think it's best if I leave," she said softly. Bimp shook her head, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "No, Aisha, you're not to blame for this. I made this mess, and I'll find a way to fix it." But deep down, Bimp knew the road to redemption would be long and fraught with challenges she wasn't sure she had the strength to face. Aisha stood firm in her decision, her heart heavy yet resolute. She methodically packed her belongings, each item a reminder of the life she was leaving behind, and prepared to return to her village. Her hope was to escape the whirlwind of pain and chaos that had consumed her, a storm she never anticipated becoming a part of. The village, with its quiet rhythm and familiar simplicity, seemed like the only sanctuary where she could piece herself back together. Meanwhile, Fi was grappling with a tempest of emotions. For days, he couldn't bear to face the walls of his home, a place that now felt alien and suffocating. He checked into a modest hotel, seeking refuge from the memories and the gnawing questions that plagued him. The betrayal by Bimp cut deep. But what unsettled him even more was the gnawing doubt about his own role in their unraveling. Had his neglect pushed her to this breaking point? Was he, in part, responsible for the desperation that drove her actions? In the quiet isolation of his hotel room, Fi picked up his phone one restless night and called his best friend. "Tund." The words poured out like a broken dam. "I'm lost. Tund," Fi admitted, his voice thick with frustration and sadness. "I don't know how to move forward." Tund listened intently, his tone calm yet firm when he finally spoke. "Marriage isn't a walk in the park, Fi. It's messy and painful sometimes. But if you love her, really love her, you'll find a way to get through this. The question is, do you want to fight for her elsewhere?" Bimp wrestled with her own torment. Her regret was a weight she carried with her every moment. Determined not to lose Fi, she reached out in every way she could think of. She sent heartfelt messages, left tearful voicemails, and prayed he would give her a chance to explain. Days turned into weeks before Fi finally agreed to meet her. They chose a quiet cafe, neutral ground where the echoes of their shattered trust wouldn't drown their words. As they sat across from each other, Bimp's emotions spilled over. "I know I hurt you, Fi. I made a terrible mistake, and I regret it with every fiber of my being," she said, her voice trembling. "But I love you more than anything. Please, don't let this be the end of us." Fi's face was unreadable, his silence an anchor in the charged atmosphere. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured yet laced with pain. "You broke my trust, Bimp, and trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. This won't be easy for either of us." In the quiet village she once called home, Aisha struggled to find her footing. The memories of her time entangled with Bimp and Fi haunted her like shadows that refused to fade. At times, she questioned her decision to leave, wondering if she had chosen the harder path. But she resolved to channel her energy into her family, taking solace in the simple, grounding routine of farming and small trading. Her siblings relied on her, and their laughter became a balm for her aching heart. Back in the city, Bimp and Fi embarked on a tentative journey toward healing. They enrolled in marriage counseling, a humbling process that laid bare their deepest wounds and vulnerabilities. Each session felt like uncharted territory, but they were committed. During one particularly emotional session, Fi confessed, "I see now that I've been distant, Bimp. I wasn't there for you when you needed me most. For that, I'm deeply sorry, Bimp." Tears streaming down her face, replied, "I know I broke your trust, Fi. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it, if you'll let me." Months passed, and progress, though slow, began to show. Fi planned a surprise getaway for Bimp, a trip meant to rekindle the love they had once cherished. They laughed together again, rediscovering joy in small, Tender moments like cooking breakfast side by side or walking hand in hand through a bustling market. Meanwhile, Aisha was finding her own strength. One day, as she tended to her family's garden, a shadow fell across the gate. She looked up, startled to see Fi standing there. "Sir," she said, her voice hesitant yet respectful. "What brings you here?" "I came to thank you," Fi said, his voice sincere, "for everything you did for my family, and to apologize for the pain we caused you. You deserved better." Aisha was taken aback by his words. "I only wanted to help," she replied softly, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and closure. As life moved forward, each of them found their own path to healing. Fi and Bimp rebuilt their marriage with newfound appreciation for each other, cherishing the lessons learned from their ordeal. Aisha, on the other hand, discovered a fierce independence within herself. She started a small business in her village, turning her hardships into a foundation for something meaningful. Though their lives were forever altered, they emerged from the storm stronger, wiser, and more resilient. They carried the lessons of their journey not as scars, but as reminders of their growth. The past could not be undone, but the future, they realized, was a canvas waiting to be painted anew. Thank you for taking the time to watch our videos, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Our channel will always update interesting content. Thank you and see you in the next videos.